Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here. Thank you all for coming. I mean, in a way, the playwright thing kind of is relevant because the way that I want to introduce the ideas and talk about them with you this evening is through stimulating the imagination. And I think the imagination and creativity are part of what we need in order to transition from what I see as a deeply dysfunctional capitalist system towards something which we could call a humane, sustainable, just society. And that is, to some extent, a task of the imagination. I want to come on later to the idea that it isn't simply about imagination, but imagination is essential to it. So, I'm going to start by asking you to imagine. It is a rainy day in England. I know that's a really difficult thing to imagine because it never rains in England. But this rainy day was in March 2009, and a somewhat younger Tim Jackson was walking home from work. And he had just been working for something like 18 months on a project within the UK Sustainable Development Commission, which was a government commission reporting actually directly to the Prime Minister. And he had been working on a question which had troubled ecological economists, ecologists generally, for quite a long time, which is this: how on earth is it possible for the economy to grow endlessly when the planet is finite? And the conventional answer to that from economists is that we just go on doing things better. We use technology to solve things. We solve climate change through shifting to renewable energy. We do things more efficiently. We use fewer resources. We dig up less out of the ground. And that way we can keep economic growth going on and on and on. And the piece of work that I carried out with the Commission was essentially a kind of critique of that argument, asking how good would our technology actually have to be in order to solve all those problems. Can we realistically solve them with technology? Is the technology economic? Does the maths add up? And beyond that, do we live in a society in which actually it's possible for a government anywhere to create that sort of technological change fast enough to solve all the problems that we were looking at? So there I am. It's a rainy March evening, and I've done all this work. I've written the report. We have ground tested it with every single government department. We've had advisors from each of those departments coming into the Sustainable Development Commission. Sometimes we've gone out to those departments. They all know it's coming. We had even asked an advisor at number 10 Downing Street whether the title of the work would be okay if we put a question mark after it or not. So the title was Prosperity Without Growth, and the suggestion was that this might be better if we put a question mark after it. Maybe we can have prosperity without growth. Could that be a thing? Does that make any sense? And some of the commissioners wanted to do the question mark, and some of them didn't want to do the question mark. And so we couldn't come to a decision about that. So we asked an advisor at number 10. Unfortunately, the advisor had been away on a trip to China when we asked the question, and we didn't get the answer back, I think, until a day before this rainy Friday. And the answer was, I don't think it really matters whether you have the question mark or not, which we took at the time to be a positive sign that we could do away with the question mark and put the report out. All this work has been done. All the press office stuff has been done. I have interviews. I've done an interview with a broadsheet newspaper, a couple of broadsheet newspapers. I have lined up radio interviews from the Monday morning when the report is launched. Everything is on track for what I truly believe to be the most influential, the most significant piece of work that I have done in my professional life. I'm almost home. I've left the station. The rain is getting heavier, so I increase my pace. And my phone rings. And I pick up the phone, and I hear one line from one of our closest advisors in government who tells me number 10 has gone ballistic. Suddenly, this is a street in London somewhere, I don't know exactly where it is. Number 10, Downing Street, has gone ballistic. The Prime Minister, who has come back from a trip and has finally maybe caught up with his advisor, maybe not, but he has clocked that someone who reports directly to him has written a report that is questioning economic growth, and he's gone ballistic. That was not the news that I'd hoped for the most influential report in my life. It didn't seem like the right way to win friends and influence people. It actually made me slightly step back a little bit. And I thought, well, we've done our work, we've done our homework, we've talked to all these people, we've got some media interviews anyway, the report will go out. If the government hates me, well, the government hates me, but at least, we have a discussion going. We have something out there that's going to create some change and build some momentum. And then I kind of sort of forgot about it. The weekend was a weekend with my kids. I spent a bit of time with them. I think we went to the park. I began to sort of breathe a little bit. It's always good to breathe, but it's particularly good to breathe when you've got to go out and do a lot of press interviews or a lot of stuff, generally in public. And so I prepared myself for Monday morning, and I got up at the crack of dawn. It was about 5:45, and I had a car to take me to a radio interview in Guildford, where there was a radio studio. I was a little bit halfway, I think, probably, along a piece of road called the Hog's Back, when I received another phone call telling me that the interview had been cancelled. It had been replaced by a news item covering the Prime Minister's constituency in Scotland. I thought that was a little bit strange, and I thought, well, that's just one interview, we got lots. There were no interviews. The broadsheets didn't publish the pieces of news. There was nothing. The report dropped like a stone into a profound, resounding silence. And that might have been, the end of Prosperity Without Grace. And then, gradually, fortunately, and partly because of the internet, and that was a time at which reports were being mostly downloaded from the internet rather than printed out and taken to people's desks, people like you began to read Prosperity Without Grace. And before I could even absorb the shock of having done this huge piece of work and having it completely fall onto a deafening silence in government, I found, and it was a very humbling experience, that there were people all over the world who wanted to talk about it, who recognized, actually, we've been living in a kind of fairy tale that says we can have it all and still save the planet. We can grow and grow and grow, and ultimately we can solve all the problems associated with that through technology or just by being very clever. And those people ranged quite literally from octogenarians, people who had been around when the Limits to Growth report was published in 1972, to A-level students, and sometimes even younger, who would come to events that had been organised around it, and sometimes sit on the floor around me as I was talking about this. And that was completely the opposite experience from being sort of a sense of, oh, I have ruined my career by pissing off the government. I found myself in a situation where there was kind of an expectation for a conversation that actually I didn't have all the answers to. I didn't know all of the questions. I didn't know exactly how to solve the problem of rising unemployment in a growth-based economy when that growth goes away. I didn't know how to solve the pensions crisis. Nobody knows how to solve the pensions crisis already. And so, the fact that I didn't know how to solve it in a low-growth world is not that surprising. But it was an indication, that conversation was amazing, it was an indication of how fertile that issue was in the public imagination. I didn't feel I prompted that conversation. I felt as though it was already there, and I could walk into places, into church halls, into women's reading groups, into financial investment companies, into chemical companies, into schools, into universities, into political places, into theatres. And I was invited into all those places to talk about this one conversation. And I think the reason is, apart from the fact that this, in spite of the government's response, had the kudos of being the first government report, allegedly government report, ever to address that issue, I think it was because it is a conversation that people want to have. A sense of discomfort, if you like, with a model of development, a model of our society that suggests that we can just go on expanding forever, that our appetites will go on forever, that we can always have as much as we want, that everybody can live the life of Elon Musk, that everybody can be a millionaire, a billionaire, whatever it takes, that our aspirations for material affluence can just continue and continue and continue. And the thing, apart from the ecological impossibility of that, two things, I think, stand out when you consider that proposition of what prosperity in the conventional sense is supposed to be. One of them is that the system has delivered nothing like that. It's delivered it for a few people, but it hasn't delivered it for everyone. And to some extent, the pursuit of it by a few people has made the conditions of life for many on the planet much, much worse rather than much, much better. And that sense, actually, that the pursuit of this materialistic dream, this imagining of a cornucopia of wealth and material affluence and comfort, has privileged some and excluded many, and to some extent worsened the living conditions for others, I think is a profound moral challenge that sits uneasily in the human psyche. We have to work pretty hard to sort of exclude that uncomfortable realization from our imagination. We have to believe in a vision of progress, which is ultimately that everybody can have that. And yet we know that it's not possible. We know that in resource terms it doesn't work. We know that climate change has not been solved. We know that we still haven't bent the curve of carbon emissions. We know that biodiversity has declined, even in the period between when that book was launched and now, and is getting worse. And we cannot quite come to terms with that. So that first sense of our own discomfort, I think, is the injustice, the moral challenge of a prosperity built on fairy tales of eternal economic growth, as Greta Thunberg calls them. That sits uneasily with us, and I think that was one of the things that prompted this sense of walking into a conversation that people wanted to have. And the second one is that in the process of pursuing this materialistic dream, the dream of consumerism, we have given something away. What is it that we might have given away? What is it that goes beyond materialism? What is it that goes beyond those aspirations for status and success and affluence, and even goes beyond that sense that we want infinite choice of any possibility, that dream of a kind of never-ending expansion of our horizons? I'm not entirely derogating that dream. I listened to Elon Musk talking finally actually about the impossibility of growth on a finite planet and thinking that the solution is to go into space, to expand into space. And of course, for a few very, very rich people over an extraordinary year last year, they all actually managed to do it. Bezos, Musk, Richard Branson actually launched them. So actually Musk hasn't done it yet, but his company has, launching people into space and saying, whoa, we are on the way. We are now an intergalactic species. And that in a sense, if that could work, if that could only work, we might not need to imagine a post-growth world. We might be able to find those planets which nobody has yet found. We might be able to travel those distances that nobody has yet worked out how to travel. And we might find ourselves a paradise out there in the stars, and then no longer have to think about a post-growth world. In the meantime, back on planet Earth, I think the task of imagining that post-growth world is incredibly profound, and it's profound in the sense that the absence of our ability to imagine that world is a place of unimaginable suffering. It's a place where people's lives don't get better. It's a place where we undermine the conditions of life. It's a place where there is potentially population collapse. It's a place where resources run out. It's a place where food supply systems don't work anymore. But also, and some of that suffering is already happening, it is a place which becomes devoid of the human spirit. It becomes a place where we are impoverished, where our imagination is impoverished, where our creativity is impoverished, where our sense of meaning and purpose is impoverished. It becomes a place where we have given away a part of our humanity for the sake of a dream of opulence that cannot realistically be realized. And we've done that because we don't like the idea of limits. We just don't like it. And I've watched, actually, advocates of growth quite carefully over the last little while, and there's some wonderful examples. Just before I wrote the follow-up book to Prosperity Without Growth, which is a book called Post-Growth, which is a much more imaginative piece. Prosperity Without Growth was written as a policy piece for government. Government ignored it. It didn't fulfill that function at all. And one of the things that I realized from that was that you can't necessarily just challenge the public imagination, the policy imagination in that way directly while we are still in the grip of the myth of growth. And to me, post-growth was very much about opening up that conversation. But just before I was writing it, opening up in a more imaginative way, if you like, just before I was writing it, I was invited to go to Davos, the World Economic Forum, the great and the good, the arbiters of growth over half a century. This was the 50th anniversary of Davos, and I was asked to go there by Deutsche Bank to participate in an event called Is Growth a Delusion? This event was held sort of, in the side streets of Davos. It wasn't in the main hall at all, but in the main hall there were fascinating advocates of growth. And one of those, actually, at that point in time was Donald Trump. And it's a fascinating sociological piece of evidence, if you like, for the something about what drives growth forward, this sense of a disrespect, a disregard, almost a hatred of the idea of limits, that limits don't matter, they don't exist, that the whole point about being human is that our ingenuity allows us to overcome limits and will endlessly allow us to overcome limits. And I watched Trump stand there, giving his speech and talking about that we should not listen to the foolish doomsayers. They are victims of outdated ideas, and there are no limits to growth. And it reminded me actually of Ronald Reagan, another US president, with the same sort of charismatic B-movie style of talking, who said there are no limits to growth because there are no limits to the human imagination, creativity, and invention. And both of these presidents, in their own ways, were talking about the sense in which they dislike and disrespect and reject the idea of limits. Reagan's analysis is particularly interesting because it wouldn't take much to agree with the idea that human imagination is unlimited. It wouldn't take much to agree with the idea that human creativity is unlimited. It wouldn't take much to agree with the idea that human inventiveness is unlimited. Our ability to solve problems, our ability to address issues, our ability to see beyond, see outside where we are. That's part of where Musk is, this sense of a sort of expansiveness of thinking about the future, an imagination of the future, a world outside the one that we inhabit, something really much, much bigger than us. And to be attracted to that is a human quality. And to some extent, that sense of creativity, that sense of invention, that sense of ingenuity in us is something that we really prize. And I think one of the reasons why we see it in American presidents in particular is because it was the sort of frontier mentality that allowed us to expand across the globe into places that were hostile, that were other people's, but that's, for the moment, not the point, and that called on us to be the best that we could be in creating a new world. And I think that is all admirable. But when you look more closely at the proposition that presents us with no limits at all, it becomes deeply problematic. That's the point at which you have to kind of separate out the sense in which there are material limits, there are physical limits, there are biological limits. We are not an infinitely immaterial species. We can't change ourselves around. We can't create meat Lego, as Mary Harrington calls it, in becoming different sorts of people. And the attempts to do that, actually, were warned against in the story about Frankenstein from Mary Shelley some time ago, and in some sense are also playing out in some of what we're trying to do to our own biology and our own humanity. I'm not saying that there aren't good things that can come out of that disrespect for limits, but I think it's really important to distinguish the things which are limited and the things that are unlimited. And that, to me, actually is precisely the task of imagining a post-growth society, is to distinguish between what is limited and what is unlimited. And that distinction, I think, allows us to think of limits themselves as our teacher, to allow limits to become a gateway to the limitless. And of course we have to imagine that limitless. We have to know where to look for it, but we have to be to some extent rigorous in our approach to it. But we also have to be rigorous in our approach to identifying material limits, identifying where they exist, identifying what they mean for us, and allowing them to show us where the limitlessness is, and then allowing us to pursue the limitlessness, that creativity, that ability to create a different kind of world. The world that we can imagine, the abilities that we can imagine, the sense of experience that we can imagine for human beings, that is not limited by material things, that is available to everyone, a sort of sense of a new humanism, a reaching beyond our own limits, but not in this kind of sense of either traveling into space or believing just out of a perverse sense of wanting to have it all, that we can overcome those material limits all the time, but rather from a strategy of accepting limits in certain places and then asking the question what it means to be human in the face of those limits. And this, I'm coming back to that second thing that I feel this debate teaches us about what we have given away. In the materialistic, consumer, hedonistic, comfort-based society, what is it that we've given away? We've given away the idea, actually, that we don't do our best when we're simply sitting in comfort. We don't exert ourselves when there's nothing to exert ourselves for. We don't strive for meaning when somebody presents their story of meaning to us and we sit comfortably back and watch it. I'm as much of a Netflix binge-watching addict as everybody in the room. And I think that as a part of our creativity does have a role to play. But I also feel that if that is the limit of our own imaginative struggles, then we are missing a part of our own humanity. We're missing that part that gets us up and out and doing things and striving for meaning and purpose. We're missing our own creativity in that process. We're missing the ability to experience extraordinary human sensations, the sensation of being alive, the sensation of being in flow, the sensation of being one with task, the sensation of understanding each other, the sensation of feeling a part of our communities and our world. And those sensations are dulled by consumerism. We have materialized ourselves out of that limitless space that we could occupy. And that proposition is one that in CUSP we have been looking at over the last little while. And I just want to finish with that story of that journey that we've gone on, looking at the psychological ability of humans to experience what you might call peak experiences. Sometimes a sense of awe, sometimes a sense of self-transcendence. The particular work that we've done has been around the concept of psychological flow. And it's a project that a psychologist called Csikszentmihalyi initiated back in the 70s with a book on flow. And flow for Csikszentmihalyi was precisely this experiential sense of being outside ourselves, in a state that is outside our normal understanding of the world, a state in which we are at one with task, a state in which we actually lose our sense of ego, a state in which we are one with the world, with the community, and with the tasks that we're doing all at the same time. And it is measurably, in psychology, associated with higher levels of well-being. It's a state that's been talked about by poets and philosophers and religious leaders. It's a state that has a legacy that goes back thousands of years. It's a state that is not entirely accidental. You don't just stumble into flow, this sense of oneness. You actually can work at it. It has particular dimensions. One of those dimensions is that it's a very fine balance between your skill and the challenge of the situation that you're in. So here you can see why when you just put yourself in comfortable situations and just crave comfort all the time, you're not putting yourself in a sense of challenge. And therefore you're not in a position where you can experience this sense of flow. You're not making the most of that limitless potential of the human being for a transcendent experience, because you're bogged down in a material sense of affluence that is never going to let you go. And so that process of putting yourself in a state of challenge, that process of, if you like, facing something that's hard, something that is a struggle, something that doesn't come easily, is one that demands that we actually translate this sense of imagination, which seems so wonderfully free, into struggle. And the psychological work that we did around this was fascinating. We discovered, for example, first of all, that many flow-based activities have light material footprints. There is a correlation between having this sort of flow experience, a negative correlation between that and the impact that you have on the planet. So here is a place where we could escape a little bit from this material limit, but not into some unimaginary spatial expansion, and not into some technological utopia, but into a sense of ourselves as different beings, of experiencing something differently. And so that finding that actually, flow-based activities have light material footprint begins to give us an answer to the problem of consumerism. If you could create an offering within a post-growth world in which what you are offering people is better, it's better than materialism, it's better than consumerism, it's better than the false promise of eternal growth, then you are in a place where you can bring people along with you. The next thing we discovered about this relationship, though, was that materialistic values disrupt the ability to experience flow. So the more materialistic our world, the more materialistic our culture, the less likely it is for people to experience that state which goes beyond the ordinary, which goes into that imaginative, limitless space. And so a materialistic world is something that we have to challenge, and I want to come back to that point, that struggle against that materialistic values. It's something that we have to challenge constantly. And we couldn't quite understand why materialism was creating this obstruction to the process of achieving flow. And we looked at it further, and we discovered a very interesting chain of reaction. One of the things that you need in order to achieve flow is the sense of self-regulation, the ability to actually engage in a skill and to address a challenge and not just to run away all the time. And that was a correlation that we could also show, that people who had higher levels of self-regulation had more ability to experience states of flow. And then we discovered another relationship, which is even more fascinating, which is that self-regulation is impaired by people who have a tendency to avoid undesirables. If you just want to look on the bright side, if you just want to look on the rosy side, if you just constantly, no, I don't want to see that, it's not very nice, I don't want to look at it, then you tend to have lower self-regulation than individuals who are prepared to look at the dark side, to look at the struggle, to face it, to accept actually that the consumerism that we have is at the cost of other people and the planet, to look into the dark side of ourselves, to explore actually what's going wrong, to not look for continual stories of success and success and success. Look, I went to number 10 Downing Street and tried to create a post-growth sense of politics. It didn't work, but here I am, 14 years later, the European Parliament has a huge beyond growth confidence. I am really successful. That strategy's been amazing. What a wonderful story. Everybody applaud, please, because that journey is the positive one that I wanted. That is not the story. That is not the journey. I did not create the European Parliament's conference on beyond growth. It was the result of many, many people doing it. But that conference is not the point. That conference is, for the most part, a sort of beauty contest of people with clever ideas standing up and applauding each other and telling each other that it's all going to be all right. It's not from doing that conference. In order to make that change, actually, we have to accept how much we failed. We have to accept that our governments are going in the wrong direction. We have to accept that carbon is not coming down in the atmosphere. We have to accept that we're destroying other species. We have to accept that we've undermined our own happiness in the process, our own sense of humanity in the process. That, facing the undesirables. By avoiding the undesirables, we undermine our self-regulation. Our self-regulation is essential to finding these states, these transcendent states, these sense of being more than human in a non-material way and creating a better world. That, I think, is our process, and that, I think, is, in a way, what I've tried to do is to start with this sense of being able to imagine things, and to argue that if we want to achieve that properly, we have to engage in struggle. We have to face the dark side. We have to face the difficult stuff. We have to engage in post-growth macroeconomics, whatever that is. We have to engage in the struggles with politicians and with vested interests that don't want to hear about change. We have to think about the dark side of our own humanity. And it's through that process, which actually, interestingly, is very much the process of the dramatist when he's constructing, or she is constructing, a dramatic narrative. You don't go from A to B in a linear sense of success. You have a process of the protagonist and antagonist, a sense of a journey, a struggle, a reversal of fortunes, and sometimes, if it's Hollywood, a kind of happy journey home. And in our case, let's hope that that happy journey home exists, but we don't get there just by imagining it. We get there by engaging in the struggle. And that's, I hope, what we can do a little bit of this evening together. Thank you very much.
Thank you.